Bonsoir to everyone, I'm Nia and I am an immigrant. Immigration today is far from a new phenomenon. According to the United Nations, 123 million people were forced to leave their homes in 2024. These are people who were persecuted by wars, violence, political regimes, and human rights violations. Imagine, one person out of every 67 on the planet is a refugee. But what does it mean, being a refugee? I would say from my own experience, it means living in uncertainty. From day to date, as long as your work or study permit gives you, it means living in a constant sense of intertemporality, when you live between there and here, between already and yet, between the past in your previous countries that you can no longer return, and the present at a new place that has not yet become your home. In addition, being a refugee also means having a need for assimilation. It touches the root of your identity and you ask, what is home for me then? Who am I in it? If you want a new country to become your home, you have to transform your language, your culture, mentality, habits. In a sense, you have to uproot yourself and plant in a new soil again. Because here, everything you knew loses its validation and you need to relearn. And how to do that? How to find yourself in these new circumstances? And for this, I suggest looking at real historical examples of those who themselves lost their home. So, in this video, we will talk about the lives and reflections of German intellectuals who fled from Nazi regime to Europe, Asia, America in the 1930s and 1940s. We will focus on the historical process of immigration, and you will see why some of the greatest minds of European culture ended up working at editing desks, in printing shops, and even on chicken farms. Why those who received an American visa or had a valid passport were called the gods of Olympus. And finally, why Stefan Zweig, Klaus Mann, Kurt Tucholsky, Ernst Stoller, and Walter Benjamin tragically chose to end their own lives. In the aftermath of the First World War, immigration expanded dramatically. That's because of the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires, and the birth of the totalitarian regime of the USSR, which caused an influx of migrants. But Europe couldn't become a worse refuge, as it was experiencing an economic crisis, especially Germany. The Treaty of Versailles imposed huge reparations on it, but Germany couldn't cope with it. In response, the French and Belgians occupied the Ruhr region in 1923, the industrial heart of Germany, and that completely paralyzed its economy. Hyperinflation and unemployment there reached levels never seen before. So, this collapse created a powerful demand in German society for radical politicians who promised to repeal the Treaty of Versailles, return the territories, and revive national greatness. Therefore, a far-right movement led by Adolf Hitler arose, combining anti-Semitism with pan-Germanism and revanchism. The Great Depression of 1929 and 1933 only strengthened its position, and the Nazi Party managed to win a majority of seats in parliament, making simple, loud, and attractive promises to the impoverished population. And only German intellectuals froze in anticipation of something absolutely terrible. And they were right. After the Nazis came to power, mass book burnings began, and blacklists were created with the names of everyone who opposed the Nazi Party or supported the communists. There were also ideological purges of universities, editorial offices, theaters, and publishing houses. Hundreds of thinkers instantly lost their jobs, incomes, and the opportunity to publish their books. And for Jewish intellectuals, the threat was generally twofold: persecution and the constant danger of deportation to concentration camps. In 1933, there were about 523,000 Jews living in Germany, that is, less than 1% of the population. And by the end of 1939, more than 300,000 of them had left the country. Among the refugees were Hannah Arendt, Walter Benjamin, Bertolt Brecht, Hermann Broch, Theodor Adorno, Thomas Mann, Klaus Mann, Sigmund Freud, and hundreds of others. That is, all those who later became an intellectual face of the 20th century. All of them became émigrés. The countries of exile of German refugees were really different, but many of them turned out to be dangerous within a few years. This is especially true in Europe, where Nazi influence was growing rapidly. We need to start with Austria, as it was the first country to experience a massive wave of refugees due to the actions of the Third Reich. In 1932 to 1934, it was ruled by Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, who established an authoritarian Austro-fascist regime there. He banned both Nazi and communist activities and relied on the support of Mussolini. But this regime didn't last long, as Dollfuss was killed in 1934. After the Anschluss of Austria in March 1938, the same mass persecution of Jews and anti-Nazis began here. About 117,000 Jewish refugees left Austria, among them Sigmund Freud, Oskar Kokoschka, Elias Canetti, Stefan Zweig, Hermann Brach, and Robert Musil. However, it was completely different in Czechoslovakia. That's because its population did not believe that occupation was possible, even after the Munich Agreement in September 1938. Of the 2,500 certificates for living for Palestine, only 10 were used there. One of them was used by Max Brod, the publisher of Kafka's works, at the very last moment. He escaped Prague on March 1939, boarding the very last train allowed to leave the country, and it was just hours before the Nazis occupied the city. In the 1930s, the Netherlands maintained neutrality, so any political activity was forbidden for everyone. The state didn't require visas, but didn't provide any assistance to refugees either. Despite this, 30,000 German and Austrian immigrants stayed here, among them Josef Rath, Irmgard Köhn, Ludwig Borger, and Klaus Mann. After the German invasion in 1940, most of the refugees, including Anne Frank family, were arrested and interned in concentration camps. Instead, Britain was the better choice. The country accepted refugees without visas, but only if they were not communists and had £50 deposited in a foreign bank. But this was practically impossible for refugees, because of the ban on holding foreign currency in Germany. So, while Britain took 1,700 Jews before the war and 10,000 Jewish children during the war as part of the Kindertransport program, over 500,000 others were never allowed to enter. And those who did could be placed by Britain in its own concentration camps to detect Nazi spies. In total, those who found refuge there included Karl Popper, Norbert Elias, Robert Neumann, Stefan Zweig, Ernst Gombrich, Elias Canetti, Oskar Kokoschka, and Fred Ullmann. Switzerland was more of a short and harsh stopover for emigrants than a refuge. Mostly because of the economic crisis, overpopulation with foreigners, the desire to maintain neutrality, and profitable ties with Hitler, in particular the coal trade. Therefore, all politically active emigrants were given 3 months to leave or were required to find a financial guarantor. Meanwhile, Jews were given a special J mark in their passports and were not allowed into the country. That's why, according to Jean-Michel Palmier, Fascist Italy and Portugal often showed themselves more humanitarian towards German emigrants than liberal Switzerland at that time. And it's worth adding, earlier, during First World War, Switzerland was the center of pacifists, expressionists, and Dadaists. But you see what happened now. Switzerland absolutely turned upside down. However, even despite that, many refugees stayed here. Thomas and Erika Mann, Alfred Kerr, Alfred Dublin, Eric Maria Remarque, Emil Ludwig, and George Kaiser. Spain was also not a good refuge at the time. The country was going through agrarian uprisings and worker strikes before the civil war of the 1936 to 1939. Francisco Franco's regime there seemed to the persecuted Germans almost identical to Hitler's. Plus, let's consider here the cultural distance, the lack of German language publishing houses, and the generally high level of illiteracy, because half of the population in Spain couldn't read. Of course, all these reasons can explain why there were almost no intellectuals who settled here. They could only join the local international brigades in the fight against Franco, but still it ended in their defeat and the participants were demobilized. Sweden became the only possible Scandinavian center of immigration, because we know Denmark and Norway had been invaded by the Germans in 1940. Sweden remained neutral and continued to trade iron ore with the Reich. However, it didn't extradite political refugees to the Gestapo as Switzerland did. Sweden only tightened immigration controls after 1937. With the outbreak of the war, Jewish refugees here had to prove financial means and the presence of relatives in the country in order to stay here. Communists, as enemies of the Nazis, were interned in local camps. The same, we already know, happened in Britain. And those who found refuge in Sweden were Kurt Tucholsky, Bertolt Brecht, Nelly Sachs, Peter Weiss, Alfred Forbad, and Ernst Cassirer. The exile in Soviet Union is probably one of the most interesting topics here. And not only because I'm Ukrainian, no. It's really interesting because, as you may know, since the 1920s, after the October Revolution, Soviet Union was seen by intellectuals as some kind of a new world, a state of socialist achievements and artistic experiments. So Weimar seemed like a bourgeois ruin in comparison. That is why about 35 German artists immigrated here, such as Erwin Schinko, Gyula Hai, Wolfgang Leonhardt, Margaret Buber-Neumann, Ruth von Meinbuch, Ernst Fischer. But you see, all of this didn't correspond to reality from the very first minutes. Their passports were taken from them at the border, returning them only upon departure. The Constitution of Soviet Union accepted far fewer refugees than it declared. And, after all, the immigrants themselves lived here in a constant fear that they would be suddenly arrested by the NKVD. It's called the People Commissariat for Internal Affairs. So, that they would be arrested for unknown reasons one night, or just sent to Siberian labor camps, or handed over to Germany for espionage or Trotskyism. However, little is known about this experience of immigration to the USSR, as many of the refugees' personal archives were destroyed at the time, or they didn't write about it for fear of persecution. All of this is extremely suspicious. France became the main center of German and Austrian immigration in Europe. About 30-35,000 refugees arrived here. They were attracted by the geographical proximity to Germany, the reputation of a hospitable country, less repressive legislation, and the cultural affinity of Paris with Berlin. Many emigrants worked there, including Heinrich Mann, Bertolt Brecht, Anna Seghers, Walter Benjamin, Ernst Toller, Alfred Dublin, Erich Maria Remarque, and Leon Feuchtwanger. But when Nazi troops entered France in 1940, all of them had to flee again, and this time to the USA. To leave France for the USA, they needed to obtain not only a visa to the US, right? But also a transit visa to Spain and Portugal, which was possible only from the consul in Marseille, but he refused to issue it to anti-Nazis. So, if you were anti-Nazi, you couldn't escape legally at all. So, this complex legal situation, which saw only passports instead of people and didn't care about anything else, it led to catastrophic consequences. It deported 75,000 French Jews to concentration camps, and only a few managed to escape. To do that, for example, Leon Feuchtwanger had to wear a woman's coat and shawl. But that was pretty easy level. A more tragic story happened to Walter Benjamin. After being refused entry to Spain at the French border, he mistakenly thought that the way back meant arrest by the Gestapo, and he ended his own life in Portbou, Spain in September 1940. His death became a symbol of European intellectual immigration. After all, these people, they continued to consider Europe as their spiritual home. They didn't want to leave it until the last. Meanwhile, Europe as their home deprived them of legal, political, and social protection. It turned its own borders into traps, and with all these bureaucratic stamps, it crossed out the lives of brilliant minds it had itself nurtured. And that's just the peak of tragicomedy. Irony that makes you want to cry. So then, obviously, we have to ask, did emigrants have any other choice in Europe? And I would say partly yeah, Between 1937 and 1940, China became almost the only country to accept European exiles without a visa or any other requirements. And for me, it's just hard to believe. You see, now we who live in a democratic world, we have visa-free status with many countries, right? But back then, when people were fleeing death, they were required to have a visa almost everywhere. Another tragicomedy. So, China accepted about 17,000 people, including Richard Paulik, a student of the Bauhaus. The refugees fled to Shanghai, either by sea or by the Trans-Siberian Railway. But after the Japanese occupation of China in 1941, the Japanese authorities began collaborating with local Nazi agents. And they put pressure on German refugees, moving them into isolated ghettos, where they lived in poverty, in epidemics, and the constant threat of bombing. So it was dangerous not only in Europe but also in Asia from any emigrants. Between 1933 and 1939, 70,000 German-speaking Jews immigrated to Palestine. It's significant that they were 600,000 Jews in Germany, but only 20,000 of them were Zionists. Mostly they considered themselves part of German culture and could follow German nationalism. Jerusalem felt like a spiritual home only for a few, such as Gershom Scholem, Max Brod, or Sammy Gronman. For everyone else, Berlin was such a home, especially for Walter Benjamin. Scholem urged Benjamin to learn Hebrew and join him in Jerusalem, but Benjamin hesitated until the last moment. He was more attracted to Moscow and Paris than to Jerusalem, and he hesitated to leave Europe. Benjamin was unable to choose between Marxism and Judaism, between friendship with Brecht and Kafka, for which he certainly paid with his life. But he wasn't alone. For most refugees, immigration here to Palestine was conditioned by the fear of alienation from European tradition and conflict with the Arab and even Jewish population. They called the refugees communists, traitors to Zionism, or kafir intellectuals, and met them without enthusiasm. That's why refugees here continued to dream of returning to Germany. The United States wasn't their spiritual home either, but at that time the US was still considered the most desirable refuge. The two centers for refugee migration in the 1930s were the American cultural capitals, New York with Broadway and Los Angeles with Hollywood. Broadway attracted intellectuals because it contained remnants of European culture, and Hollywood because it was a cultural desert. In Hollywood, without any competition, you could realize the ideals of the Weimar Republic. Create your own Weimar on the Pacific, as Los Angeles was often called at the time. The most prominent writers and composers of Germany lived here at the same time, namely Bertolt Brecht, Heinrich Mann, Alfred Doblin, Leon Feuchtwanger, Vicky Baum, Hans Eisler, Elma Mahler, Franz Werfel, Bruno Walter, Elisabeth Hauptmann, Theodor Adorno, Wismar Schleichheimer, where they wrote their dialectic of enlightenment, by the way. Also Thomas Mann, Arnold Schoenberg, directors Fritz Lang, Jean Renoir, Max Reinhardt, Otto Preminger, actress Marlene Dietrich, and many, many others. Rarely in the history of humankind has one city hosted such an impressive combination of talents, and it was absolutely no coincidence that two outstanding minds met right on the streets of the city. And that's amazing. Another reason for the mass migration to Los Angeles was the help to refugees from Salka Viertel. She was a famous Hollywood actress and screenwriter. Viertel not only held intellectual salons in her home with well-known émigrés, but she also was a co-founder of the European Film Fund and mediated contracts with Hollywood studios. This allowed her to help obtain emergency visas to the USA for many refugees. By the way, Ernest Hemingway also helped with visas for his comrades from the Spanish Civil War, namely Hans Kahl, Gustav Regler, and Alfred Kantorowicz. Sinclair Lewis and Dorothy Thompson did the same. Trying to move to the USA or once settled there, German refugees faced a whole range of difficulties. What kind of difficulties? Legal, financial, and not least cultural. Yet despite these obstacles, the United States offered hope, while Europe, so culturally close to Berlin and so understandable, was rapidly becoming dangerous. Hollow Mann, the historian and essayist, son of Thomas Mann, described this ambivalent situation in the 1930s this way. I would say that the exiled writer was an unwelcome guest. Europe in the late 1930s was poor and petty, anguished and inhospitable to foreigners. The Hitler regime was unloved, but those Germans who had rejected Hitler's domination and protested against it were not loved anymore. Not to be unraggy with the proper authorities, not to have a valid passport was always something that aroused suspicion. The same questions. What exactly do you want here? How long are you going to stay? When are you leaving? We have heard them so often, and not only from the mouths of bureaucrats. How much of our time has been wasted by this harassment, which we had to put up with in order to obtain anywhere a limited permission to stay, parsimoniously granted? How harshly did it act on our humiliated nerves? The fact is that in those days, the physical existence of a refugee was not enough to justify any help. A refugee had to provide a valid document in the country where one was seeking asylum. The passport determined the migrant's entire life, and when its validity expired, the refugees gradually lost their legal existence, any legal protection. Demonstrative here is the story of Fred Ullman. I would like to share it with you so you could understand more this harsh situation. So, Fred Ullman was a German Jewish writer who fled to France after the Nazis came. Here, in a cafe on the way from Marseille to Paris, he once lost his wallet with his passport, which he had left unattended in his jacket pocket. For a foreigner in France, this meant disaster, because now he could easily be interned in local camps or sent back to Germany directly, into the hands of the Nazi authorities. So, in desperation, Ullman left his number with the cafe owner and drove on. The next day, he received a phone call. His wallet and passport had been found by a fellow believer, who agreed to return them, keeping some of the money. And, thanks to this chance, Ullman avoided arrest and reached England within a few weeks. But you see, his incident clearly shows how fragile the situation of a refugee was. A few days without a passport could cost him his freedom and, in case of deportation, perhaps even his life. Therefore, Klaus Mann fairly asked in 1938, what Frenchman, Englishman, or American can imagine what it means not to have a passport? A man without a passport is a semi-man, unable to leave. We, the emigrants, learned this, and we learned it again each day. The situation was complicated by the fact that in the same year most of the German refugees ended up with expired passports. Unfortunately, it turned out to be impossible to renew them. And no one was ready for this, because German law had previously provided for the loss of citizenship only as an exception, and the refugees were convinced to the last that the exile was just allegedly unwanted vacation, and the Nazi regime would soon fall. No one even realized how long their absence would be, and everyone dreamed of returning home at the first opportunity. But at home, at the same time, they were already considered foreigners, non-citizens, ausgebürgert, in translation, deprived of nationality. Hitler's regime used deprivation of citizenship as an instrument of political punishment. He took away the passports of all those who didn't show loyalty to the Nazi ideology and the Reich, and didn't obey the order to return to Germany. This affected not only Jews, but also thousands of well-known political opponents, writers, journalists, and scientists, including Alfred Kerr, Otto Strasser, Erwin Piscator, Heinrich and Klaus Mann, Kurt Tucholsky. What's interesting here, in addition to his citizenship, Thomas Mann was also deprived of his doctoral degree. So, as you can see, the presence of world fame didn't guarantee the ability to stay in one's place under the sun. A significant contrast here is the position of Martin Heidegger, who in 1933 joined the Nazi Party and took up the position of rector of the University of Freiburg. Unlike his exiled colleagues, Heidegger publicly supported the new government in his rector's speeches and actually chose to cooperate with the regime. Contrary to this, staying in Germany didn't always mean being pro-Nazi. Karl Jaspers, for example, refused to support the Nazi Party, but for this, he was expelled from the university and deprived of the right to publish his works. The philosopher's wife, Gertrude, who was of Jewish origin, was even threatened with a deportation. So, in fact, the Jaspers couple had to live the entire Second World War with poison in their pockets, constantly expecting the Nazis to come to their home. So, they had to be ready to pass away. To summarize everything that has already been said, we can conclude that the refugees had a hard time both inside the host country due to the constant atmosphere of suspicion and outside. Outside, they also experienced legal humiliation, difficulties with visas, and generally living out of a suitcase. Stefan Zweig recalled in his autobiography, The World of Yesterday, Memories of European, some important details. When those of us who had once conversed about Baudelaire's poetry and spiritedly discussed intellectual problems met together, we would catch ourselves talking about affidavits and permits, and whether one should apply for an immigration visa or a tourist visa. Acquaintance with a stenographer in a consulate who could cut down one's waiting time was more significant to one's existence than friendship with a Toscanini or a Roland. Human beings were made to feel that they were objects and not subjects, that nothing was their right, but everything merely a favor by official grace. They were codified, registered, numbered, stamped, and even today, I, as a case-hardened creature of an age of freedom and a citizen of the World Republic of my dreams, count every impression of a rubber stamp in my passport a stigma, every one of those hearings and searches a humiliation. Unlike Heidegger or Jaspers, many of their fellow exiles lived in precisely the conditions described by Stefan Zweig, such as Walter Benjamin, Hannah Arendt, Theodor Adorno and Horkheimer, Ernst Cassirer and Herbert Marcuse. Only a few of them managed to obtain citizenship from other countries for their literary merits, or at least buy it and become citizens of Panama, Guatemala or Honduras. But for most refugees, European countries were not only unwilling to grant citizenship, but also refused to extend their residence permits if they didn't have a valid passport. This partly explains why more and more immigrants began to hunt for a visa to the United States. After all, firstly, it's another continent, remote from the influence of the Nazis, and secondly, one that offers legal protection, unlike Europe, and, at the expense of democracy, guarantees them freedom from persecution by the Gestapo and deportation to concentration camps. But getting an American visa was extremely difficult, as the US migration system operated on quotas. The smallest quotas applied to Central and Eastern Europe, the regions from which most refugees fled. Moreover, they also had to prove financial independence, find American guarantors, affidavits of support, go through complicated checks, and wait years for consulate decisions. Therefore, Valery Marko ironically wrote to Herman Kesten in 1940, "You cannot travel to Portugal without an American visa, or at least possessing a valid passport, something that only the gods of Olympus possess." But the gods of Olympus continued to experience humiliation even in the US. They faced poverty, despair, and hunger here, because often after leaving Germany their material gains were practically zero. The Nazi regime limited the amount of money that Jewish refugees could take from German banks, and introduced high immigration taxes. After 1938, taxes were replaced by confiscation of assets, so refugees lost everything when leaving Germany. Everything. However, they didn't stop them as long as the price of freedom was much higher. It was pretty easy to find work here in the US and overcome poverty for artisans and merchants, but it was extremely difficult for writers, journalists, and philosophers. They were left without a German-speaking public, cut off from the German press, and moreover banned in the Reich. Exiled publishing houses, to which the refugees could send their poems, reviews, or translations, they couldn't provide them with a decent fee, both because of the high competition among the thousands of refugees and because of the lack of readership. This fee was more like a stingy tip, as Max Brad called it, for which one could only pay the hotel bill. Emigrants also couldn't live on the expense of the refugee aid committees. They provided the strict minimum: legal protection, a small amount of money, canteen tickets, possibly accommodation in some hostel, but all of this was just temporary. Given all these bitter circumstances, many prominent exiled writers used their prestige to rescue other refugees in distress, such as Thomas and Heinrich Mann, Ernst Toller, Ludwig Marcuse, Franz Werfel, Stefan Zweig, and others. But of course, their help couldn't save everyone. For this reason, Jean-Michel Palmier said that a large number of intellectuals had to become secretaries, typists, accountants, hotel porters, or errand boys. Many political activists became manual workers. Poets, such as Hans Henry Jahn or Walter Hassenclever, one of the founders of German Expressionism, even worked as farmers. And these are not exceptional stories. The same one happened with Karl Zuckmayer. He arrived in the United States in 1940 as a guest of Dorothy Thompson, and Zuckmayer, like most German writers, tried to get a job in Hollywood, writing scripts for film adaptations of famous novels. But the thing is, this experience became a turning point for him because his independence of thought was a significant burden for Hollywood. And teaching at Erwin Piscator's New School of Theatre, which he tried later, was low paid. That's why it seemed that it was more profitable to earn money by being a farmer. Really, a farmer. So Zuckmayer abandoned literary activity for the sake of farming, of raising cattle and selling milk, being completely outside the bounds of any intellectual life. And surprisingly, he called his chickens after Nazi officials. Perhaps such irony was the only way for him, like for many other immigrants, to survive this economic decline from writer to farmer. So, okay, we have already talked about the loss of a profession, right? But it wasn't just about a loss of income and living in poverty. It was also about a loss of cultural identity, and I really want to talk about that. In Europe, all these refugees were writers, philosophers, directors, right? In America, they were low-skilled workers, just foreigners with the accent, and that's all. So their upbringing in the traditions of universities, theaters, and salons, all this sophistication of taste and intricate language, all of it was just unnecessary complexity here. In America, they needed not only to acquire a new profession, but also a new style of thinking. They had to be focused on practicality, on quick results, and the tastes of the masses. That's why began a new stage of immigration for refugees, a clash of cultures, and I suppose it was the most painful one. Let's take a look at the difference by comparing Weimar with Hollywood. German culture was avant-garde and elitist, based on historical tradition and organized only around Berlin and Munich as kind of ghettos for artists. It was directed toward a progressive, educated public and aimed to overthrow old values and break taboos. That is, to raise the new level of public awareness of system flaws. Meanwhile, Hollywood created understandable, just simple plots and emotions, focusing on satisfying all the audience. It served the existing taste instead of creating a new one, as Europeans did in constant experiments. The public here wasn't supposed to learn something new to enrich its worldview, but the creators were supposed to constantly explore the taste of the public in order to serve it. That's why mass culture and consumerism began to form in the USA, and that's what we see even today. You may ask, what was the reason for such differences? And I feel like you would be surprised. It was just different economic vertical. The real cultural power in the USA was not in the hands of the artists, as in Europe, but in the hands of those who owned the capital and all the means for the production of art itself. That is, the one who invested money in production and had the opportunity to control it, set their requirements and tastes. All the others who work on the product had to implement them, having a minimum of creative freedom and independence, like the screenwriter or film director. Intellectuals in this system were ordinary hired workers, and their original ideas almost never satisfied the capitalists. The quality of an idea was assessed not by its innovation, but by the profit received from it. Therefore, American studios were ready to modify stories beyond recognition, just to adopt them to the masses, and, accordingly, to have a greater profit. At the same time, hundreds of such stories were needed for at least one of them to become successful. Despite that, even with the success of the film, the writers didn't gain the same fame as in Europe. They remained casual workers in the background, when the actors received the main attention. So, fortunately or not, the title of Hollywood as a giant factory of stars is still relevant to this day. Of course, the system didn't suit many people. Most German intellectuals were deeply disappointed with it, like Karl Zuckmayer or Bertolt Brecht. Especially disappointment were those who fled to the US at its invitation. Here I mean contracts with film companies such as Paramount or Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, which helped the refugees obtain visas to the USA. And such were Heinrich Mann, Alfred Dublin, Leonard Frank, Alfred Polgar. The only problem was that these companies knew absolutely nothing about their works, and the writer faced harsh exploitation. And that's no exception. Even such outstanding directors as Fritz Lang or Max Reinhardt met with the same amount of disappointment and humiliation, neglecting their personal style almost completely. Even worse was the situation of German actors. They, in order to play in American theaters, had to get rid of their German accent, speak English well, and change their manner of gesticulation, which was suitable only for German silent films. Only a few succeed in it. Absolutely the same was the German musicians. They were looking for work here as composers in Hollywood, but that means they had to abandon any grandiose motifs and create simple background sounds or musical effects that would only emphasize dramatic moments in film scenes, and that's all. That's why Hans Eisler, according to Brecht's memoirs, shared on his occasion that Hollywood music spoiled his hearing. That's why it was more profitable to work as a teacher at universities or private schools than to work in Hollywood. And it had its results. The creation of the first departments of musicology in the USA was due to immigrants, in particular Arnold Schoenberg. But this Austrian composer still remained loyal to the European tradition. In a letter to Oskar Kokoschka in 1946 he wrote, "You complain of the lack of culture in this world of entertainment. What you would say then of the world I live in, which disgusts me to death? I'm not just thinking of the cinema. The following advertisement will give you an example. It shows a man who had run over a child with the child lying dead in front of his car. He is holding his head in despair, but not to say something like, 'My God, what have I done?' For underneath it the words are, 'Sorry, now it's too late to worry. Take out your policy at the WW insurance company in time.' And how to teach these people composition?" That's probably the most funny and precise quote I met about this cultural gap. But still, considering it, the so-called New Weimar in the United States remained an isolated cultural ghetto, as we saw. And emigration didn't change the creative style of most intellectuals, with a few exceptions, such as George Gross and Kurt Weill. Also, another reason for this may also be the contempt for American culture, which the immigrants saw from the height of their European superiority. Surprisingly, they also experienced reluctance to learn English, which they also considered the language of businessmen. So ultimately, we can ask ourselves, did that mean, this cultural gap, that the Germans had never been able to break with Europe mentally? Did they continue to live in nostalgia for Europe? The same one that deprived all these refugees of their home? This position took on a tragicomic ambiguity. In American society they were Germans, and therefore suspicious. To Germany itself, traitors, and to themselves, people between worlds, who could neither return nor fully assimilate. They were strangers everywhere. And you know what was the first thing that gave them away? It was their accent. The victims of Nazism spoke the language of their tormentors. And that was enough. The Germans were burdened with the same barbaric stigma that had once driven them to flee. How could a German be a friend to an American if one spoke the language of the enemy? Thus, in Britain, for example, Vansittardism was quite widespread, an anti-German movement named after the diplomat Robert Vansittart. According to it, Nazism was a consequence of the German character, and that's why all Germans should bear responsibility for their crimes. In the USA, at the same time, Germans were accused of sympathizing with communism, even though, of course, that didn't prevent them from selling copies of books by Thomas Mann, Brecht, or Remarque, just as it didn't prevent the world from awarding one of the first Nobel Prizes in literature to the German Heinrich Hesse, a writer whose books continued to be published in the Third Reich at the time. In that case, what did the Germans themselves think? According to the memoirs of Ludwig Marcuse in his biography My 20th Century, his colleague Erich Marie Remarque once answered in an interview, "I am no longer German, I don't think German, I don't feel German, and I don't talk German." After that, to an American journalist who asked him if he sometimes felt nostalgic for Germany, he replied ironically, "What makes you think that I am Jewish?" Remarque was one of the few who was willing to renounce any affiliation with Germany. He ridiculed the widespread sense of nostalgia that most Jewish refugees had. This was not relevant for long, at least until the war began. Later they all saw the real crimes of the Nazis, and the more they were exposed, the more the refugees felt hatred and guilt for belonging to the same nation as the Nazi murderers. On this occasion, Thomas Mann gave a speech on May 1945 addressing all Germans. In it, he first raised the issue of Germany's duplicity. Supposedly, there is a good Germany of Goethe and Schiller, and a second, evil one, of Hitler. But in reality, Germans need to finally look in the mirror. There is only one Germany, and every German is that. He said, "There are not two Germanys, a good one and a bad one, but only one, whose best turned into evil through devilish cunning. Wicked Germany is merely good Germany gone astray. Good Germany is in misfortune, in guilt, and in ruin." Some perceived their German origin as a curse, and photographs with swastikas made refugees nauseous. But still, they remained in some kind of emotional duality. Longing for the Allied victory over the Nazis, it was painful for them to watch the Allies bombing the city in which they had spent their childhood. The same with culture. Using German was perceived as complicity in crime, but it was painful for them to abandon it. Their whole life was built on it. This put psychological pressure on them inside. Outside, all these political defeats, the destruction of Europe, the impossibility of returning. And in the end, for some, this pressure became irresistible. And I think it's very appropriate to remember their names. This was the case, for example, with the already mentioned Walter Benjamin. His story on the Spanish border was no exception. Walter Hassenclever also took his life in the Limil internment camp after the Nazis' rapid advance on France. And this wasn't only due to fear of the Gestapo, but also due to despair. For this intellectual, the defeat of France meant the end of the very idea of Europe, both as cultural space and as the last hope for a normal life. The fall of the Spanish Republic in the 1938 had a similar effect. Ernst Weiss was an Austrian doctor who had treated Hitler after the First World War. That's why he had dangerous knowledge and was imprisoned for a time in a concentration camp. Realizing this powerlessness in the face of Nazism, he wanted to at least stop Franco's fascist regime, but he couldn't. The German playwright Ernst Toller was equally devastated by the defeat of the Spanish Republicans. He was among the first to be persecuted, his name appearing on Hitler's initial blacklist. After he found out Franco's victory, Toller took his own life in a New York hotel room in May 1939. The only items found on his desk were photographs of Spanish children killed during the war. Among other famous novelists was Joseph Roth. He immigrated to Paris predicting the barbarity of the Nazis. However, the feeling of homelessness and uprootedness didn't leave him for a moment. It had begun with the loss of his homeland, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but now his last illusion, Germany, was also fading away. Then Roth resorted to prolonged alcoholism, this chronic self-destruction, disintegrating along with the world he loved, and he died in 1939. Unlike all of them, the German publicist Kurt Tucholsky lost face even before the outbreak of the Second World War. By order of Goebbels, his books were burned in 1933. Like Ernst Toller, his name appeared on the first blacklist, and he was deprived of his German citizenship the same year. Tucholsky was among the first, alongside Thomas Mann, to recognize the mortal dangers that Germany posed to Europe. Worn down by illness and powerlessness in the face of the growing evil, he poisoned himself in 1935. The story of Stefan Zweig is exceptional. He had everything in exile: safety because he had citizenship, status because he had readers all over the world, and shelter. However, even this couldn't instill in him his former faith in liberalism and humanism as the basis of European spirit. Zweig perceived the annexation of Austria as a personal humiliation. In his farewell letter, he wrote that he had become homeless because his spiritual home, Europe, had been destroyed, and in 1942 he took poison. Klaus Mann did the same. The idea of taking his life haunted him throughout all this period. In his literary work, he was always in the shadow of his father and uncle Thomas and Heinrich Mann, and was constantly compared to them. That's why these constant doubts about own writing abilities and the experience of exile psychologically exhausted him. Even the victory over Hitler and the overthrow of the Nazi regime didn't give him hope. Mann passed away in 1949. All these lost lives are not just words, and they can hardly be described as private tragedies. They seem to point to something far greater, a symptom of an entire epic, a limit reaction of the human being to historical condition, and probably to the experience of exile, in which one lost not only a homeland, but also a language, profession, legal status, a sense of the future, and even the legitimacy of one's own existence. And this was not what individuals wished to say history through the symbolic act of death. Rather, it was what history sought to express through them. Because, you see, when history is saturated with barbarism, it inevitably reproduces the same barbarism, externally in the form of war and internally in the form of personal disintegration. So, I think this is precisely what happened to Benjamin, Toller, Zweig, Mann, and many others. The world to which they, among its greatest minds, cried out in pain and issued warnings of war, this, exactly the same world, proved incapable of protecting them. Some were killed by tanks, some were destroyed by closed borders, bureaucracy, and indifference. And do you know what was the sin that could have saved them? I suppose it's writing, and it's writing that remains our key to understanding both their experience and the time in which they lived. So finally, I will recommend you some books written in exile. I think they can shed more light on this topic, which I can't do in this video due to some time limitations, of course. So these are Mephisto, Volcano, and Escape to Life by Klaus Mann, Flotsam or Liebe deinen Nachsten by Erich Maria Remarque, Define Hitler by Sebastian Hefner, trilogy The Waiting Room, especially its third part Exile by Leon Feuchtwanger, Refugee Conversations by Bertolt Brecht, The Seven Crows and Transit by Anna Seghers, The World of Yesterday, Memoirs of European by Stefan Zweig, also essay We Refugees by Hannah Arendt, and also her essays in the German language emigrant newspaper Aufbau, Mini Memoralia by Theodor Adorno, Karl Zuckmayer's memoirs A Part of My Self-Portrait of an Epic, Salka Viertel's The Kindness of Strangers, and finally Elias Kennedy Memoirs. There should be like 3 parts of it, I believe. So thanks to all these works, thanks to them, we can not only get acquainted with the history of exile, but also see how exile changed their thinking and identity. What do you think about this experience of emigration? Which of the stories of exile seem closest to you, and why? Do you recognize maybe our present time in it? Write about all this in comments, and also subscribe to the channel so as not to miss any new videos. Thank you very much for watching.